Young-Hair's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his mahogany desk. His eyes locked on the 2:34 a.m. timestamp flickering on the monitor. Okay, pause for a second. I need to know something. Where are you right now? What are you doing while you're listening to this? Because I'm imagining some of you are folding laundry, some are pretending to work, and at least one person is listening to this in the bathroom. If that's your respect, no shame here. Leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you're invested in watching Shauna absolutely demolish everyone who wronged her, do me a favor, hit like and subscribe. More stories like this are coming, and you're not going to want to miss them. All right, let's get back to it. The surveillance room felt like a tomb. Blue light from 6 monitors carved harsh angles across Young-Hair's face, illuminating the dragon tattoo that crawled from his collar to his jaw. There she was again, Sienna Bates, the African-American chef he'd brought to Shanghai 3 months ago, moving through the industrial kitchen like she was rehearsing a crime. In the grainy night vision feed, everything about her screamed guilt. She paused at the walk-in freezer, glanced over her shoulder twice, then wrapped something in a thermal bundle and tucked it beneath her chef's coat. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the fabric. Young-Hair had built the Dragon's Shadow Syndicate on instinct, on seeing betrayal in the set of a man's shoulders before he even committed the act. He'd suspected Sienna from the moment Ms. Bancha came to him 4 weeks ago with the inventory logs. Premium Hanwoo beef, gone. Imported Matsutake mushrooms, vanished. Bone broth made from ingredients worth more than most people's annual salary, missing from the cold storage every 3rd night. She's desperate, Ms. Bancha had said, her voice honeyed with concern. Americans always are, probably selling to restaurants in Pudong to pay off those family debts you were generous enough to overlook. It made perfect sense. Sienna was an outsider, isolated, barely speaking Mandarin, working brutal shifts in a kitchen where the staff treated her like a contamination risk. She needed money. Everyone in his world needed money. But watching her now, caught red-handed on his million-yuan surveillance system, still made something cold settle in Young-Hair's chest. He'd wanted to be wrong. Sienna disappeared down the corridor toward the north wing, the forbidden hallway where his children's rooms consumed the entire eastern section of the compound. The same north wing Ms. Bancha had specifically warned Sienna never to enter on her first day. Young-Hair leaned forward. His jade ring caught the monitor's ghostly light. His phone sat on the desk beside the keyboard, its weight a familiar promise. This was it, the proof he needed. One phone call and Sienna Bates would be handled. Not killed, he wasn't an animal, but removed permanently. Deported back to whatever American city she'd crawled from with enough fear burned into her memory to never speak of what she'd seen here. His finger moved toward his phone. But something made him wait. The camera inside Lynn's bedroom activated, motion triggered. The feed was sharper here. He'd installed military-grade equipment 8 months ago when the children's behavior started changing, when their laughter disappeared from the compound like smoke. The room appeared on screen. Silk curtains, hand-carved furniture imported from Suzhou, twin beds that cost more than luxury vehicles, and his children. Lynn and Hui sat huddled together on the floor between their beds, skeletal thin in designer pajamas that now hung off their small frames like fabric draped over wire hangers. Even through the camera, Young-Hair could see Lynn's ribs pressing against his shirt. Hui's arms looked like branches that might snap. Her hair, usually glossy from Ms. Bancha's meticulous care, fell in matted clumps around her hollow face. Then Sienna entered the frame. What happened next made Young-Hair's breath stop completely. Sienna knelt on the floor beside his children, unwrapping the stolen bundle with shaking hands. Inside was a thermos, steam rising as she twisted it open. The children's eyes, those same dark eyes he saw in his own mirror, eyes he'd been too busy to look into for months, suddenly focused, desperate, alive. Lynn reached for the thermos with trembling fingers, but Sienna gently intercepted his hands. She pulled out a spoon, filled it with what looked like golden congee, and brought it carefully to the boy's cracked lips. His son, who Ms. Bangcha swore was simply a picky eater going through a phase, opened his mouth like a starving animal. Yang Hair watched, paralyzed, as Sienna fed his son with a tenderness he'd never seen in his violent world. Between each spoonful, the American chef wiped Lin's chin, whispered something that made the boy's eyes shine with tears, and then continued feeding him with the patience of someone who'd done this before, who chose to do this. Lin ate and ate and ate. When the thermos emptied, Sienna produced another container, rice porridge. It looked like, thick with what might have been shredded chicken, and his daughter consumed it, her skeletal hands gripping Sienna's wrist as though afraid the food would vanish. That's when he saw it in the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows. The children's dinner tray from earlier that evening, sitting untouched on the dresser. The official meal Ms. Bangcha's staff claimed the children had refused. Except the tray wasn't filled with food. It was empty, completely, impossibly empty. Yang Hair's hand moved across the keyboard with sudden violence, pulling up the hallway camera from 7 hours earlier. He watched Ms. Bangcha herself enter his children's room with a covered tray. Watched her set it down on the dresser with theatrical care. Watched her lean close to Lin and say something. He had no audio, but he could read the head housekeeper's lips clearly enough. Your father says you'll eat when you've learned to behave. The ice in Yang Hair's veins turned to fire. He cycled back through a week of footage, then 2 weeks, then a month. The same pattern every single day. Ms. Bangcha bringing empty trays covered with silver domes, staging the meals for the cameras. His children begging, actually begging with their small hands pressed together, for food that never came. The staff entering to check on them, but bringing nothing except dismissive glances and whispered cruelties. His own children wasting away in a compound full of servants paid to protect them. And Sienna, brave, desperate Sienna, who everyone assumed was stealing to survive, was actually stealing to keep his children alive. The surveillance room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Yang Hair's vision blurred. His hands that had broken men, hands that had built an empire from ash and blood, shook as he gripped the edge of the desk. He'd trusted them. Ms. Bangcha, who'd served his family since before he was born. The staff who'd bowed to him every morning for decades. He'd trusted them completely, had delegated his children's care to them because he was too important, too consumed with running the syndicate to handle domestic matters. And they'd been killing Lin and Hui slowly, methodically, right under his nose. On screen, Sienna was braiding Hui's hair. The little girl leaned against her, eyes half closed, a ghost of a smile on her starved face. Lin had curled up beside them, his head resting on Sienna's knee, his breathing finally steady and deep. The American chef who spoke broken Mandarin and had every reason to hate this place was cradling his children like they were precious, while the people he'd paid to love them had turned them into skeletons. Yang Hair's finger hovered over his phone, but the call he needed to make now was very different from the one he'd planned 5 minutes ago. The Dragon's Shadow Syndicate was about to learn what happened when someone touched his children. And Sienna Bates was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous man in Shanghai could also be grateful. Yang Hair rewound the footage for the 4th time, his thumb pressing the button with enough force to crack the plastic. The timestamp blinked at him like an accusation. 2:34 a.m. He'd been in this suffocating surveillance room for 3 hours now, the blue glow from the monitors turning his office into something that felt less like a command center and more like a confessional booth for other people's sins. Sienna Bates moved across the screen like a ghost haunting his kitchen. The night vision camera stripped her of color, turning her into shades of green and gray, but it couldn't strip away the guilt written in every movement. She stopped at the walk-in freezer, her head swiveling left then right, checking for witnesses that didn't exist at this hour. Then she reached inside and pulled out something wrapped in butcher paper, his premium Hanwoo beef, if the size and shape were any indication. The bundle disappeared beneath her chef's coat with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Many times before. Yang Hair's jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. He'd built the Dragon's Shadow Syndicate by trusting his instincts about people, by reading the micro-expressions that revealed intention before action. And every instinct he possessed had been screaming at him for weeks now, ever since Ms. Bongcha had walked into his office with the inventory reports clutched in her elegant hands. The numbers had been damning. 2 kilograms of Hanwoo beef, gone. A half kilo of imported matsutake mushrooms vanished without explanation. Bone broth made from ingredients that cost more than the average Shanghai worker earned in a month, disappearing from cold storage every few nights like vapor. "She's desperate, Mr. Yang," Ms. Bongcha had said, her voice carrying that perfect blend of concern and disappointment that made him trust her judgment implicitly. "Americans always are when they're drowning in debt. I suspect she's selling to high-end restaurants in Pudong. The black market there pays premium prices for your quality ingredients." It had made perfect, terrible sense. Sienna was isolated in a country where she could barely order tea in Mandarin, working punishing shifts in a kitchen where his staff treated her with the warmth of a January harbor. She'd broken down during her interview 3 months ago, sobbing about her mother's cancer diagnosis in Atlanta, the medical bills that had already bankrupted her family, the desperate need for any job that paid enough to make a dent in the debt. He'd hired her anyway. A moment of weakness, perhaps, or maybe he'd simply wanted to believe that showing mercy wouldn't come back to bite him. On the monitor, Sienna checked the corridor one final time, then moved toward the north wing with the bundle pressed against her ribs like stolen treasure. The north wing. The one place Ms. Bongcha had explicitly forbidden her to enter on her first day, when the head housekeeper had laid down the compound's rules with the precision of a general outlining battlefield strategy. Yang Hair's phone sat within arm's reach, its dark screen reflecting the surveillance feeds like a mirror. One call. That's all it would take. His men could be here in minutes, could have Sienna Bates on a plane back to America before the sun rose over the Huangpu River. Not killed, he wasn't a monster, but removed, permanently, with enough fear carved into her bones that she'd never speak about what she'd seen in his world. His hand moved toward the phone, fingers extended. But something made him hesitate, something about the way she moved, not frantic, not panicked like a common thief, purposeful, like someone with a destination that mattered more than the risk. The camera feed switched to the north wing corridor. Sienna disappeared through the doorway. Yang Hair leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silence. His finger hovered over the phone. Maybe he'd watch just a little longer, see where this thief thought she was going. See what she thought was worth risking everything for. 3 months earlier, Sienna had stepped into the Dragon's Shadow compound kitchen with her knife roll clutched against her chest like armor that might actually protect her from something. The space had stolen her breath, not from beauty, but from sheer intimidation. Industrial stainless steel stretched in every direction, gleaming under fluorescent lights bright enough to perform surgery. Walk stations lined one wall like soldiers at attention. The walk-in freezer hummed with a sound that reminded her of a hibernating beast. Everything was pristine, professional, and utterly foreign. Ms. Bongcha had been waiting for her, spine straight as a blade, hands folded at her waist. The head housekeeper wore her authority like expensive perfume, invisible but impossible to ignore. "Miss Bates," the woman's English had been flawless, but cold enough to frost glass. "Welcome to your new position. I trust you understand the privilege Mr. Yang has extended by hearing someone with your circumstances." Sienna had swallowed the shame that crawled up her throat. Yes, she understood. She understood that begging for a job while crying about your dying mother wasn't exactly a power move. She understood that accepting a contract to work in Shanghai for a man whose business dealings she didn't dare ask about made her either brave or desperate, and she was pretty sure which one applied. "Thank you," she'd managed. "I won't disappoint him." Ms. Bongcha's smile had been thin as paper. "Your station will be here." She gestured to the far corner of the kitchen, a prep area partially hidden behind a structural pillar, where the lighting was dimmer and the ventilation struggled to reach. "You'll handle vegetable preparation, stock reduction, and whatever tasks the head chef assigns. You do not leave this area without permission." The other kitchen staff had watched this exchange with faces carved from stone. 7 people, all Chinese, all looking at Sienna like she was a stain on their pristine workspace. Nobody had smiled. Nobody had offered to shake her hand. One of the sous chefs had actually stepped back when she'd moved closer, as though proximity to her might be contagious. "One more thing," Ms. Boncha had said, her voice dropping to something that lived between warning and threat. "The north wing of this compound is forbidden to all kitchen staff. Mr. Yang's children reside there. Their care is my responsibility, not yours. Their meals are prepared by senior staff only and delivered by me personally. You will never, under any circumstances, enter that wing. Do you understand?" "I understand," Sienna had replied, though she hadn't understood at all. What kind of household needed to forbid the cook from seeing the children? But she'd learned long ago that questions were expensive luxuries she couldn't afford. Ms. Boncha had studied her for a long moment, dark eyes searching for something, doubt, maybe, or defiance. Whatever she'd been looking for, she must have been satisfied with Sienna's carefully blank expression. "Good. Your first shift begins at 4 a.m. tomorrow. Do not be late. Mr. Yang does not tolerate failure." Then she'd left, her heels clicking against the tile like a countdown to something Sienna couldn't name. The kitchen staff had continued staring at her in silence. Nobody had offered to show her where anything was. Nobody had explained the procedures. They'd simply returned to their prep work as though she'd ceased to exist the moment Ms. Boncha walked away. Sienna had stood in her designated corner, surrounded by the best kitchen equipment she'd ever seen in her life, and felt more alone than she'd felt in her entire existence. She'd unpacked her knives in silence and pretended not to notice that nobody bothered to learn her name. It took Sienna 3 weeks to notice the pattern, and another 2 days to believe what she was seeing. The children's meals were prepared with religious precision every morning and evening by the head chef himself, always under Ms. Boncha's watchful supervision. Sienna would catch glimpses from her corner station as he plated delicate portions of steamed fish, perfectly molded rice, and vegetables cut into shapes that looked more like art than food. Everything arranged on pristine white plates, covered with silver domes that caught the kitchen lights like promises. Ms. Boncha would arrive precisely on schedule, inspect each tray with the intensity of a jeweler examining diamonds, then carry them toward the north wing with the careful reverence of someone transporting something sacred. The routine was flawless, untouchable, a well-rehearsed performance that everyone in the kitchen had clearly learned not to question. But Sienna had developed a bad habit during her 5 weeks in Shanghai, insomnia that left her wandering the compound's service corridors at odd hours, too anxious to sleep, too exhausted to do anything productive. On one of those restless nights, she'd taken out the trash from her prep station around 10 p.m., hauling the bag through the back corridors toward the industrial waste area behind the kitchen. That's when she'd seen Ms. Boncha. The head housekeeper stood beside the large waste bins, her elegant silhouette backlit by the security lamp. She held a covered tray, the same silver dome Sienna had seen leaving the kitchen 6 hours earlier for the children's dinner. Ms. Boncha lifted the dome with one hand, and even from 15 feet away, Sienna could see that the food beneath was completely untouched. The fish still had its garnish perfectly placed. The rice still held its molded shape. Not a single chopstick mark disturbed the presentation. Ms. Boncha scraped everything into the trash with the mechanical efficiency of someone emptying an ashtray. Sienna had frozen in the shadows, her own trash bag forgotten in her grip. The head housekeeper replaced the dome, checked her watch, then walked back toward the main building with the empty tray as though she'd just completed another routine task. The next night, Sienna took out her trash at the same time. Ms. Boncha appeared again, right on schedule. Another pristine meal disappeared into the waste bin, breakfast this time, the morning congee still steaming slightly in the night air. The third night, Sienna watched from a different angle. Same result. Perfect food, untouched, wasted. The fourth night, she arrived early and checked the bins before Ms. Boncha appeared. She found 3 days' worth of children's meals buried under other garbage, 18 separate plates of food that had never been eaten, still arranged with the careful artistry the head chef had poured into them. Her hands shook as she lowered the bin lid. The kitchen prepared 6 meals a day for those children. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. 2 children, 6 meals. And every single one was ending up in the trash, pristine and untouched, like the meals had never reached their intended destination at all. Or like the children had never been given the chance to eat them. Sienna's stomach turned cold. She thought about Ms. Boncha's warning on her first day, the absolute prohibition against entering the North Wing. The way the head housekeeper guarded access to those children like a dragon guarding treasure. But what if she wasn't guarding them at all? What if she was hiding them? Sienna stepped back from the waste bins, her breath coming faster. She should mind her own business. She should focus on paying off her debts and getting home to her own mother. She should not ask questions about things that could get her killed in a syndicate compound. But 18 perfect meals in the trash meant something was very, very wrong. And Sienna had never been good at ignoring hungry children. Sienna waited until 2 a.m., when even the night security guards retreated to their stations for tea and cigarettes. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved through the service corridors, every shadow feeling like an accusation, every creak of the old building like an alarm announcing her betrayal. The North Wing entrance loomed before her, an ornate door that looked more decorative than functional, but when she tested the handle, it opened with barely a whisper. Ms. Boncha's security apparently relied on fear rather than locks. The hallway beyond smelled wrong. Not dirty exactly, but stale. Like a room that hadn't been properly aired in months. Sienna's chef instincts picked up other things too, the absence of cooking smells, the lack of that lived-in warmth that comes from people actually inhabiting a space. She found the children's rooms at the end of the corridor. What she saw through the first doorway made her forget to breathe. 2 children sat on the floor between their beds, not playing, not reading, just sitting. The boy looked maybe 8 years old, the girl perhaps 6. Their designer pajamas hung off their bodies like fabric draped over wire frames. Sienna could count their ribs through the silk. Their arms looked like branches that might snap. The girl's hair fell in matted clumps around a face that was all eyes and cheekbones, her skin stretched so tight it looked translucent in the dim light. They looked like photographs Sienna had seen of famine victims, like children who'd been starving for months. The boy noticed her first. His head snapped up, eyes going wide with something that looked more like hope than fear. He started to stand, then seemed to think better of it, as though standing required more energy than he possessed. "Are you?" His Mandarin was weak, breathy. "Are you bringing food?" Sienna's throat closed. She stepped into the room, her professional mask crumbling. "When did you last eat?" The girl, Hui, she must be Hui, made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so broken. "Ms. Boncha brings meals, but father says we can't have them until we behave better." "Your father said that." Lin shook his head slowly, like the movement cost him. "Ms. Boncha tells us. Father is too busy with important work to care about whether we eat. She says if we were better children, worthy children, he would make time, but we're disappointing him." The words hit Sienna like a fist to the gut. She looked around the room, at the untouched toys in the corner, at the water glasses sitting empty on the nightstand, at the window where she could see small fingerprints on the glass, as though someone had been trying to lick condensation. "How long?" Her voice came out strangled. "I don't know anymore," Lin whispered. "Months. Ms. Boncha says father wants us to learn discipline, that successful children in his world don't need food every day, that we're weak for wanting it." Hui had started crying silently, tears running down her hollow cheeks. "We tried to be good. We tried so hard, but we're still so hungry." Sienna's hands were shaking. She thought about the perfect meals in the trash, the silver domes covering food these children never saw. Ms. Boncha's carefully constructed performance for a man, too, consumed by his empire to verify that his children were actually eating the meals he paid for. This wasn't neglect. This was systematic starvation. This was torture disguised as discipline, hidden behind a locked door and a warning that kept everyone else away. Sienna knelt beside the children, her decision already made despite every survival instinct screaming at her to run. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice steady even though her whole body trembled. "Your father does care. Someone has been lying to you, and I'm going to make sure you eat, do you understand? Starting tonight. Lin stared at her with those enormous eyes. Ms. Bangcha will punish us. Ms. Bangcha won't know. Sienna stood, her mind already calculating. Not yet. She had 3 hours until the kitchen staff arrived. 3 hours to figure out how to save 2 children without getting herself killed in the process. It would have to be enough. The first time Sienna stole from Yang Hair's kitchen, her hands were steady as a surgeon's. She'd spent the entire previous day cataloging waste. Not the obvious garbage, the rotting vegetables or spoiled proteins that even Ms. Bangcha's militant inventory system wouldn't miss, but the invisible waste. The rich marrow bones that would be simmered once for stock and then discarded, still heavy with nutrients. The outer leaves of bok choy that the head chef stripped away to reach the tender hearts. The fish heads from the morning's prep, destined for disposal despite having more collagen and minerals than the pristine fillets they'd been separated from. In a kitchen that processed ingredients worth more than most Shanghai apartments, Sienna realized that the trash bins held enough nutrition to save 2 starving children. She just had to be brave enough, or foolish enough, to take it. At 2:00 a.m., long after the last kitchen staff member had retreated to the servants' quarters, Sienna returned to her corner station. The portable electric burner she'd found buried in a storage closet sat hidden beneath a folded apron. 1 small pot, 1 wooden spoon, tools that could either save lives or end hers. She started with the bones. 4 chicken backs that had already given up their first layer of flavor to the day's consommé but still held treasure in their marrow. She covered them with barely 3 cups of water. Any more and the smell might travel too far through the compound's ventilation. The heat had to stay low, the simmer so gentle it was almost a whisper. While the bones surrendered their essence, Sienna worked on the vegetables. The wilted bok choy leaves, chopped fine enough to nearly dissolve. Ginger root with a bruised end, minced to release its warming properties. Mushroom stems the head chef considered garbage, diced small and added for their umami depth. A handful of rice from her own dinner ration, because she could afford to be hungry in a way those children couldn't. The porridge took shape slowly, thickening into something that looked humble but smelled like comfort. Sienna tasted it, adjusted the salt, added a whisper of white pepper. Not for flavor, though that mattered, but because traditional Chinese medicine taught that pepper helped weak digestion. Every ingredient was chosen not just to feed but to heal. She poured it into a thermos at 3:47 a.m., the metal still hot enough to burn her palms through the kitchen towel she wrapped it in. Then she tucked it beneath her chef's coat and became a thief for the second time that night. The north wing hallway felt longer every time she walked it. Every shadow held Ms. Bangcha's silhouette. Every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps coming to catch her. But when she pushed open the children's door and saw Lin and Hui sitting in the darkness, waiting for her with a hope that was almost worse than their hunger, Sienna knew she'd walk this hallway 1,000 times if that's what it took. "I brought dinner," she whispered. Lin's eyes glistened. "You came back." "I told you I would." She fed them slowly, carefully, fighting against their desperate need to devour everything immediately. "Small sips," she murmured, guiding the spoon to Hui's lips with the same precision she used for plating at 5-star restaurants. "Your bodies need time to remember this." Between spoonfuls, she wiped their chins and told them stories about her mother's kitchen in Atlanta, about Sunday dinners and the smell of cornbread, about a world where food meant love instead of punishment. She made them laugh once, a small, fragile sound, when she described her first attempt at cooking Chinese cuisine and how she'd used 5 times too much Sichuan peppercorn. The thermos emptied. The children's breathing deepened. They looked less like skeletons and more like exhausted kids fighting to stay awake. "Tomorrow night," Lin asked, his voice small. "Tomorrow night," Sienna promised. She returned to the kitchen just before 5:00 a.m. when the morning prep crew would start arriving. The pot was washed and hidden. The burner was tucked back beneath the apron. The borrowed thermos sat in her locker, waiting to be filled again. Her corner station looked exactly as she'd left it 16 hours ago. No evidence of her midnight kitchen, no trace of her crime. Except for the missing bones that nobody inventoried, the wilted greens that nobody valued, and the 2 children in the North Wing who were beginning to remember what it felt like to be full. Sienna Bates had become a thief, and she'd never felt more like a chef in her entire life. Ms. Boncha discovered the discrepancy on a Thursday morning during her weekly inventory audit. The premium items were accounted for, every gram of Hanwoo beef, every matsutake mushroom, every bottle of imported truffle oil documented with the precision that had made her Yang Hair's most trusted household manager for 15 years. But something nagged at her as she reviewed the waste logs. The garbage weighed less than it should. Not dramatically less, not enough that anyone else would notice. But Ms. Boncha had built her career on noticing the invisible. She pulled up 3 weeks of waste disposal records and ran the calculations twice. Then a third time, her perfectly manicured nail tapping against the spreadsheet with increasing irritation. Someone was taking scraps, bones that should have been discarded, vegetable trim that belonged in the compost, fish heads, chicken backs after stock production, wilted greens. Individually, worthless, collectively a pattern. And patterns meant someone was operating outside her control. She found Yang Hair in his study that afternoon, reviewing shipping manifests with the focused intensity that had built his empire. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting to concern when he saw her face. "Ms. Boncha, what's wrong?" "We have a problem, Mr. Yang." She set the printed reports on his desk with deliberate care. "I believe your instincts about Miss Bates were correct. She's stealing from the kitchen." His jaw tightened. "You have proof?" "Not yet, but the waste logs don't lie." She walked him through the numbers, her voice carrying that perfect blend of disappointment and vindication that made her so effective. "She's been careful, nothing obviously valuable, but bones, scraps, trimmings, ingredients that still have secondary market value if you know where to sell them. Street vendors pay well for such things, restaurants in the cheaper districts. She's selling garbage." Yang Hair's tone suggested he found this somehow more offensive than if she'd stolen diamonds. "Your garbage is better than most restaurants' inventory, Mr. Yang, and Miss Bates is desperate. Those American medical debts aren't going to pay themselves." Ms. Boncha paused, letting the implication settle. "But there's something else that concerns me more." "Which is?" "The timing of the missing scraps coincides with the late hours she's been keeping. I've noticed her in the corridors at odd times, near the North Wing." She watched his expression darken with satisfaction. "I warned her explicitly that area was forbidden." Yang Hair stood, his hands curling into fists on the desk. "You think she's stealing from my children's wing?" "I think she's using her access to the compound for activities beyond her employment agreement. What those activities are..." Ms. Boncha let the sentence hang, poisonous with implication. "I believe we need concrete evidence, something that will hold up if legal action becomes necessary." "What do you suggest?" "Enhanced surveillance, military-grade cameras, motion-activated with feeds that go directly to your private monitors. Install them in the kitchen, the corridors, the North Wing. Everywhere Miss Bates moves, you'll see it." She leaned forward slightly. "Catch her in the act, Mr. Yang, not just with inventory reports, but with footage that shows exactly what she's doing, who she might be selling to, whether she's involving your children's safety." The last phrase was calculated. Ms. Boncha knew that threatening Yang Hair's children, even theoretically, would override any hesitation about invasion of privacy or staff morale. His eyes went cold. "Make it happen. I want those cameras operational within 48 hours. I'll contact the installation company immediately." Ms. Boncha gathered her reports, allowing herself the smallest smile as she turned toward the door. "We'll catch her, Mr. Yang, and then you can decide what justice looks like for someone who abuses your generosity." After she left, Yang Hair stood at his window, staring out at the compound grounds. The American chef had seemed so genuine during her interview, so desperate and grateful. He'd wanted to help her. But Ms. Boncha was right. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with his children's safety potentially at risk. He picked up his phone and dialed the security contractor himself. "I need your best system. Money is no object. I want to see everything that happens in my home." 2 days later, 37 new cameras went live throughout the Dragon's Shadow compound. Motion activated, night vision capable, recording to encrypted drives that fed directly to Yang Hare's private surveillance room. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for Sienna Bates to walk into it. The cameras went live on a Wednesday at midnight, and Yang Hare told himself he'd check them casually, maybe once a day, just to confirm Ms. Boncha's suspicions before taking action. Instead, he found himself in the surveillance room at 1:47 a.m., unable to sleep, watching the feeds with the obsessive focus of a man who suspected he'd been deceived, but didn't yet know by whom. The kitchen camera showed Sienna at her corner station, working under a single task light. She moved with practiced efficiency, wrapping something in a thermal bundle. The same pattern Ms. Boncha had warned him about, but before Yang Hare could feel vindicated, the North Wing cameras activated. Motion in his children's hallway. The timestamp read 2:15 a.m. The feed showed Ms. Boncha entering Lynn and Hui's room, not with a food tray, but with empty hands and a posture that radiated fury. Yang Hare leaned forward, his breath catching. His son stood by the window, holding a small bowl. Even through the grainy night vision, Yang Hare could see the water inside it, probably condensation Lynn had scraped from the glass, something Yang Hare remembered doing himself as a child during summer nights. But this wasn't summer, and his son wasn't collecting water for fun. Ms. Boncha crossed the room in 3 strides. Her hand moved so fast it blurred on camera. The slap sent the bowl flying from Lynn's grip, water spraying across the floor. The boy stumbled backward, his skeletal frame offering no resistance to the force. Yang Hare's hand slammed against the desk. The sound echoed through the surveillance room like a gunshot. On screen, Ms. Boncha leaned close to Lynn, her mouth moving with words Yang Hare couldn't hear but could imagine. His son crumpled to the floor, arms wrapped around his too thin body, and Ms. Boncha stepped over him like he was garbage as she left the room. The feed continued. Lynn didn't move from the floor. Hui crawled from her bed to sit beside her brother, both children pressed together in the darkness like abandoned animals. Yang Hare's vision blurred. His hands shook so violently he had to grip the desk to steady them. Then, at 2:34 a.m., Sienna appeared in the doorframe. The American chef knelt beside his children with a gentleness that made Yang Hare's chest feel like it was caving in. She unwrapped her stolen bundle, not inventory to sell, but a thermos of porridge made from the kitchen's garbage. She filled a spoon, brought it to Hui's lips, waited patiently while his daughter ate with the desperate hunger of someone who didn't know when food would come again. Between spoonfuls, Sienna wiped Hui's chin, whispered something that made his daughter's eyes glisten. Then she turned to Lynn, still crumpled on the floor, and helped him sit up with the care someone might use handling broken glass. She fed his son, checked the bruise forming on his cheek from Ms. Boncha's slap, pulled out a second container of porridge because she'd known, somehow this stranger had known, that one wouldn't be enough. And when both children had eaten everything she'd brought, when their breathing had steadied and their shaking had stopped, Sienna began braiding Hui's matted hair with infinite patience, working through the tangles while humming something soft and American. His daughter leaned into her touch like a plant bending toward sunlight. Lynn curled against Sienna's side, his head on her knee, and for the first time in the footage, Yang Hare saw his son's face relax, saw the terror leave his eyes, saw him look like a child instead of a prisoner. The woman everyone believed was stealing from him was actually saving his children's lives, while the woman he'd trusted to care for them had been slowly murdering them with calculated precision. Yang Hare rewound the footage, watched Ms. Boncha slap the water bowl again, watched Sienna braid his daughter's hair again, watched the truth destroy everything he'd believed about loyalty, about trust, about who deserved his protection and who deserved his rage. His phone sat on the desk, but the call he needed to make had changed entirely. Ms. Bongcha had set a trap to catch a thief. Instead, she'd caught herself committing something far worse than theft. She'd caught herself torturing children. And Yang Hair was going to make absolutely certain she understood what happened to people who touched his family. The Dragon's Shadow Syndicate had taught him many things about justice. Ms. Bongcha was about to receive an education. Yang Hair called the mandatory household dinner for Friday evening, giving no explanation beyond the 3 words that made his entire staff freeze. Attendance is compulsory. The dining hall hadn't been used for a full household gathering in over 2 years. Staff members filed in with the nervous energy of people who sensed something had shifted in the compound's atmosphere, but couldn't identify what. Ms. Bongcha arrived last, her posture immaculate, her expression carefully neutral except for the smallest satisfied curve at the corner of her mouth. She thought this was her vindication, her moment to watch the American chef be exposed and removed. She had no idea she was walking into her own execution. Sienna sat at the far end of the table, her chef's coat pressed and clean, her hands folded in her lap. She looked exhausted, terrified. But when her eyes met Yang Hair's across the room, he saw something else there too, a quiet resignation, as though she'd already accepted whatever judgment was coming. That almost broke him. "Thank you all for coming," Yang Hair began, his voice carrying the controlled calm that his associates knew meant someone was about to suffer. "We have a matter of theft to address. As you know, Ms. Bongcha has been tracking inventory discrepancies from our kitchen for several weeks." Ms. Bongcha's smile grew fractionally wider. "To resolve this situation, I installed enhanced surveillance throughout the compound, military-grade cameras, motion-activated, recording every movement in every room." He paused, watching his staff shift uncomfortably, including the north wing. The head housekeeper's smile faltered. "I want to show you all what those cameras captured." Yang Hair picked up a remote, and the projection screen behind him flickered to life. "So we can all understand exactly who has been stealing from this household." The first clip showed Sienna in the kitchen, wrapping her thermal bundle. Several staff members nodded, their expressions confirming their suspicions. Ms. Bongcha leaned back in her chair, vindicated. Then the second clip began. Ms. Bongcha entering the children's room, Lin holding his bowl of water, the slap that sent it flying, the boy collapsing to the floor. The dining hall went absolutely silent. Yang Hair let the footage play, showed Ms. Bongcha leaving the children in the dark, showed them huddled together on the floor, then showed Sienna entering with her stolen porridge, feeding his starving children with hands that trembled but never faltered. "This woman," Yang Hair said, his voice dropping to something that made the temperature in the room plummet, was accused of stealing premium ingredients to sell for profit. But what the cameras actually show is her stealing garbage, bones, wilted vegetables, scraps, to keep my children alive." He advanced to the next clip, Ms. Bongcha bringing an empty tray covered with a silver dome into the children's room, setting it on the dresser, leaning close to whisper something cruel, leaving without feeding them. "This footage is from 6 weeks ago. Would anyone like to guess how many times this pattern repeats?" Yang Hair's eyes found Ms. Bongcha, who had gone white as bone. 147 times. 147 meals my children never received. 147 times they were told their father didn't care if they ate. The head chef looked like he might be sick. The sous chefs were staring at Ms. Bongcha with horror. The house staff had pressed themselves back in their chairs as though proximity to her might be contagious. "Ms. Bongcha convinced me to install these cameras to catch a thief." Yang Hair's voice was soft now, which somehow made it more terrifying. "She was right about the theft. She was just wrong about the thief." He advanced to the final clip, Sienna braiding Hui's hair, Lin sleeping peacefully against her knee, 2 children who looked like skeletons finally resting because someone had cared enough to feed them. "Sienna Bates stole from my kitchen to save my children's lives. Ms. Bongcha stole something far more valuable." He turned to face his head housekeeper directly. "She stole my children's health, their trust, nearly their lives, and she did it while I paid her to protect them." Ms. Bongcha stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Mr. Young, I can explain." "Sit down." She sat. "The only reason you're still breathing," Young Hair continued, his voice like ice over deep water, "is because I want you to understand something first. You gambled that I was too busy running my empire to notice what happened in my own home. You were right. I failed my children by trusting you." He looked at Sienna, who was crying silently. But someone else didn't fail them. Someone who had every reason to mind her own business chose to risk her life instead. Someone who everyone in this room treated like garbage turned that garbage into salvation. Young Hair pulled out his phone. "Ms. Boncha, you're terminated. You and anyone else who knew about this have exactly 1 hour to leave my compound. After that, you become a problem my security team handles permanently." The head housekeeper stood on shaking legs, her carefully constructed authority crumbling. "You can't." "I just did. Get out of my sight before I change my mind about letting you leave alive." Ms. Boncha fled. 3 other staff members followed her, their faces ashen with guilt. When the dining hall finally emptied, only Sienna remained, still sitting at the far end of the table, her hands folded, her eyes wide with disbelief. Young Hair crossed the room and did something he'd never done for anyone outside his family. He knelt. "Miss Bates," he said quietly, "I need to ask for your forgiveness." Sienna Bates had never imagined that forgiveness could feel so heavy. She'd stammered something to Young Hair in the dining hall, words she couldn't remember now, something about just doing what anyone would do, about not needing thanks. He'd stood, his jaw working like he wanted to say more but couldn't find the language for it, and then he'd asked her to follow him to the north wing. To his children. The hallway felt different now, not forbidden, but sacred. Young Hair walked ahead of her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Sienna saw something in his posture that looked like fear. He stopped outside Lynn and Hui's door, his hand on the handle, but he didn't open it immediately. "I haven't been in this room in 8 months, he said quietly. "Ms. Boncha always said they were fine, that they were sleeping or studying or didn't want to be disturbed. And I believed her because it was easier than admitting I'd become the kind of father who was too busy for his own children." "They need you," Sienna said. "Not the man who runs the syndicate, just their father." He nodded once, then opened the door. Lynn and Hui sat on Hui's bed, holding hands the way they'd been doing since Sienna first found them. They looked better than they had 4 weeks ago, their faces less hollow, their eyes brighter, but they were still so small, still so fragile. When they saw their father in the doorway, they flinched. That flinch broke something in Young Hair's expression. He crossed the room slowly, then did something that made Sienna's throat close. He knelt on the floor in front of his children, bringing himself to their level, making himself small instead of towering above them. "Lynn, Hui," his voice cracked. "I failed you. Ms. Boncha told me you were being cared for, and I believed her because I was a coward who didn't want to face how little time I spent with you. She told me you were eating, and I didn't verify it because I was too consumed with business to check. She told me you were happy, and I accepted that lie because it was convenient." Hui's lower lip trembled. "Ms. Boncha said you didn't want us anymore, that we weren't good enough." "She lied." Young Hair reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement like someone approaching a frightened animal, and took his daughter's hand. "You are everything. You are why I built this empire, and I forgot that somewhere along the way. I'm so sorry." Lynn spoke, his voice barely audible. "Are you going to send Miss Sienna away now that you know?" "Send her away?" Young Hair looked back at Sienna, who stood in the doorway trying not to intrude. "No, I'm going to ask her to stay, if she'll forgive me for how my household treated her." "Stay," Sienna repeated. Young Hair stood, still holding his children's hands. "The North Wing needs a new guardian, someone who actually cares about the people living in it, someone who sees Lynn and Hui as children instead of inconveniences." He met her eyes. "I want you to take over their care, officially. You'll have full authority over their meals, their schedules, their well-being. A salary that actually reflects your value. Respect from every person in this compound, or they'll answer to me." Sienna thought about Atlanta, about her mother's medical bills, about the plan to work off her debt and go home. Then she looked at Lin and Hui, who were staring at her with expressions that were equal parts hope and terror that she might say no. "I'll stay," she said, "but I have conditions." Young Hair raised an eyebrow. "Name them." "You eat dinner with them at least 4 times a week. No excuses. No business emergencies that can't wait an hour. You show up, and you be their father, not their boss." Something like relief crossed his face. "Done. What else?" "I choose the household staff for the North Wing. People I trust. And if I say someone's treatment of these children is unacceptable, they're gone. No questions." "Agreed." And Lin and Hui learned to cook with me. In a real kitchen. Not as servants, but because everyone should know how to feed themselves and the people they love. Hui's eyes went wide. "We can learn to cook." "If your father allows it," Sienna said. Young Hair looked at his daughter, saw the first real smile he'd seen from her in months, and nodded. "Whatever Miss Sienna thinks is best." The next morning, the compound underwent a transformation. The staff who'd participated in the children's neglect were gone, replaced by people Sienna personally interviewed and approved. The North Wing was cleaned from top to bottom, windows thrown open to let in air, and light for the first time in months. New kitchen equipment was installed in a small prep area adjacent to the children's rooms. And for the first time in 8 months, Lin and Hui ate breakfast with their father at an actual table, not on the floor in the dark. Sienna watched from the doorway as Young Hair showed his son how to properly hold chopsticks, as he listened to his daughter describe the story Sienna had read to them the night before. He was awkward, clearly unpracticed at being present, but he was trying. That was enough for now. "Miss Sienna," Hui called from the table, "will you eat with us?" Sienna had been the outsider for so long, the cook relegated to the corner, the foreigner treated like contamination, the thief stealing scraps in the dark. But when she sat down at that table, with 2 children who trusted her and a father who'd finally learned what mattered, she realized she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. A family that needed her as much as she needed them. "Always," Sienna promised. And for the first time since arriving in Shanghai, she meant it.